Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Future of Climate Tech. We are joined here with our esteemed panelists, Ryan Bethencourt, Sierra Peterson, and Ramez Naam. I will give you a second to introduce yourselves, but first, just to say a word about myself. My name is Tommy Leep. I'll be the moderator. I'm an investor in pre-seed climate tech companies through a fund called Jetstream. Ryan, would you please say a word about yourself?
Yeah, I'm the founder and CEO of Wild Earth. We're the leading plant-based and cell-based pet food company in the US. I've also been involved with investing in about 170 companies on two platforms here on AngelList. So the first is Sustainable Food Ventures, and the second is actually a Web3 fund called Layer One Ventures, which just recently launched.
Thank you, Ryan. Sierra?
Certainly. My name is Sierra Peterson. I am a co-founder at Voyager Ventures. We are an early stage fund focusing on investing in decarbonization in North America and Europe, everything pre-seed through Series A. And we are a new fund that is 28 years in the making. Climate stabilization is my life's work, also the work of my co-founder, Sarah Sklarczyk. And we have been working on all things climate tech now for the better part of 3 decades. Policymaking, investing since 2015, advanced academic research, and building between the two of us 5 climate tech companies. So we're happy to talk all things climate tech and delighted to be here today.
Thank you, Sierra. Ramez.
Hey, I'm Ramez Naam. I've been a climate person since about 2010 when I wrote a book about how to innovate to solve climate, food, water, and energy. I've been investing in climate tech since 2014. I'm the managing partner and founder of a fund called Planetary.vc. Invest in early stage, pre-seed to Series A, like Sierra. I'm one of the people that was bold enough to forecast early on in 2010, 2011, that we'd see exponential cost declines in technologies like solar and batteries, and it will continue to in a number of other technologies in the clean tech area.
Thank you, Mez. Your data from that period is legendary and well known, I think, among many climate investors. So we appreciate your work. All right, let's get right into a discussion. So climate tech has had many ups and downs in the 21st century. In the mid 2000s, VC poured more than 25 billion into the climate sector and lost more than half of it. That sparked a prolonged slump in the climate tech investing sector. But today we're seeing renewed enthusiasm, which is why we're all here in our climate tech space. So what's different today as opposed to 10 years ago that makes climate tech a good bet?
I'm happy to take this one. We all have thoughts here. So yeah, I mean, this is the biggest economic opportunity we've seen, the possible decarbonization of the global economy. It is not limited to energy as clean tech 1.0 really focused on. This is foundational decarbonization across food production, across mobility, across the built environment, across all segments of the global economy, where we're seeing now decades of R&D pay off in creating products that are simply better performing and lower cost than the fossil fueled incumbents of yesterday. So it's financially driven. The technology is better, it's cheaper. And so it's appealing to a wide swath of buyers who are simply motivated by better performance and better price than an incumbent technology that's unsustainable. That's one. And then two, obviously, the commitments to net zero operations from massive segments of the market, corporates, governments, people around the world, that's creating the market demand. It's really speeding the trajectory of deployment. The third thing, obviously, is the founders. The founders showed up in a major way about 2 years ago, folks recognizing that this is the moment to build in climate tech. And that's when Sarah and I, the co-founder at Voyager, decided to launch the fund. We'd been investing our own money for years beforehand, but we realized those 3 elements, the technology being better, lower cost, the market demanding it, and then the founders showing up to build that next set of billion-dollar companies in this multi-trillion-dollar opportunity, that was the moment to launch an institutional fund. So that's what's different.
I think Sarah just nailed it. Let me just add a couple visuals to back up exactly what she just said, which was dead on. If you look at Climate Tech 1.0, if you go back to 2004, this is data from Bloomberg Energy Finance, we spent $32 billion a year deploying clean energy. This year, 2022, we'll spend around $1 trillion deploying clean energy. And that is, it's a doubling every 4 years. And that's really just solar, wind, electric vehicles, and batteries. there's still a huge number of sectors to go. But as Sierra said, these technologies have just plunged in cost. So now clean energy is the cheapest energy, cheaper than fossil energy. Electric mobility is going to be cheaper than fossil mobility this decade. And to the very important point that Sierra made, it's not just electricity and cars we have to decarbonize. Though electricity and cars are less than 40% of the problem, actually more like 35%. We have to do ag, land use, deforestation, cattle. We've got to do heavy industry, steel, cement, the stuff that goes into the clothes that you wear, how we heat our homes, eventually how we do transportation. There's a huge range of things here, and it touches food and water in other ways, recycling. So it's really an enormous set of challenges that we've seen people want to solve. Governments want to solve, and consumers want to solve, and so businesses want to solve for those reasons.
Maybe I'll jump in with a perspective. My area is really, I love everything, the whole area around climate tech, and really seeing this area rise as a technology category. It's been something I've been very, very excited about. But my unique angle here is really food and consumer. And I think what we're seeing is consumers wanting better products. And so what we're doing is we're using new technologies. We're also using new manufacturing technologies. So whether that's plant-based products, recombinant or fermented products, or even what's called cell-based or lab-grown meats, that's something that's been rising. We've seen the first approval that's actually happened of cell-based meats. It was a little over a year ago in Singapore, and we're starting to see more and more approvals, and it looks likely that possibly next year we'll start to see approvals in the US too. And so I think our entire food system is being moved into the future, right? It's inevitable that we will eat better, cleaner food manufactured in unique ways that are, of course, less heavy on the environment. It's inevitable that we're going to be using electric cars, that we're going to be using clean energy. All of these things, to me, as someone who is, I describe myself as a technology maxi, it is inevitable. It's something that I want to embrace, and I do with my life as well. And I know that many, many other consumers, including, we have over 60,000 customers at Wild Earth and growing. Many of our consumers at Wild Earth have a similar perspective, right? They are not anti-technology; they're actually pro-technology, but pro more sustainable technology in everything, in how we live, all the way through to how we eat and the products that we use.
Thank you, Ryan. So given how much funding is going into climate tech, how many new technologies are developing from now onwards, the founders that have shown up, where are we? What's the state of the world? Are we close to the technologies that we need to kind of stave off the worst effects of climate change, or do we still have a long way to go?
When I started in the space in about 2010, forecasts were that we would be looking at somewhere between 4, 5, or 6 degrees Celsius of warming by 2100. And that's when you get really, truly apocalyptic climate changes happening. Now, we have not solved climate change, but now forecasts based just on the economics of climate tech bring us down to somewhere in the 2 to 3 degrees Celsius range. If you look at the variety of papers, I'm saying 2.5. The IEA's slightly aggressive, their middle scenario brings it in at 1.9 with error bars. We'd love to get that down to 1.5. We'd love to reduce uncertainty, but we've bent the curve from really, really civilization threatening to bad, but we can survive it. And I need to bend it further and further down. 3/10 of a degree we can bring it down matters. And half of that is tech that's already at commercial scale. Mm-hmm. And half of it is tech that's pre-commercial scale. So there's room for both, and for things like government R&D.
Completely agree. The worst seems now further off than it once did, which is, I think, heartening to those folks who are building in this space. And what we're seeing too is that there's a shift in recognizing the peril that we have created for ourselves. We are losing hundreds of species every single year to extinction. That is unconscionable. And yet, while the climate system is destabilizing at an accelerating rate, climate technologies are becoming better and better cost and more accessible and more likely to be deployed on a timeline that is ecologically meaningful, that sort of sub 10-year timeline. So we have so much available now. The cost declines of the past 10 years, as pointed out, in solar, wind, energy storage, the inflection points that we've seen in transportation. The dominant paradigm is now electrification. We're not going back to an internal combustion fueled paradigm for light duty transportation. It's just, the technology is ever accelerating around electrification there. So big forces are at play that, continue to give us a sense of optimism and also focused deployment and investment in the technologies that are poised for that massive commercial scale in a sub 10-year window that is one aligned with venture scale return profile and with ecological benefit, given the tipping points that we're seeing around the world.
And I just wanted to add from a consumer perspective. So I think a lot about the consumer, right? And how do we make better products across the board? They can't just be more sustainable. And this is one of the really interesting insights. It has to be everything. It has to be a better product. If it's food, it has to be better for the planet, better for you, and tastier. If it's for our, for our pets, with Wild Earth, the plant-based side of the equation, dogs on plant-based diets actually live a year and a half longer. This is a new peer-reviewed published study that came out this year, a year and a half longer of lifespan, right? So these are the kind of things that we really focus on, which is we're making better products across the board. Not only is it better for your pet, it's better for the planet, but it's recyclable, and we add new technology as we go through. And so I think with all of these technologies, if we think about self-driving cars, why do you buy a Tesla? Well, yeah, it's a great car, it's sustainable, it looks great, but by the way, it's also semi-autonomous. And it has all of these others. So I think that for those of us that are building these companies, we have to think about not just the environmental impact, but then how do we make it better for the consumer as well? And that's really the unlock point. And many of these technologies are there. That we are at that inflection point for many of these technologies.
Great, thank you. So, in addition to the technological development, we're getting some assistance, maybe I'd say, from the government, both from the regulatory perspective and then funding, such as the Inflation Reduction Act. What role does government play? Is it possible to regulate our way out of the climate disaster? Or do we need government subsidies to encourage the technological development? Or is it just incumbent on the private sector to invent solutions and figure things out, maybe I'd say, on our own?
Yeah. So as a former policymaker, I have some thoughts here.
Great.
Also, as a technology investor, I also have thoughts. Technology itself is what shifts the chemistry and the physics of the climate system. Policy does not. So unless we actually have deployment of real infrastructure, real physical products, we're not going to change the system as it stands. The way that we see the deployment of that speeding up is through the market mechanisms that really do determine the trajectories of deployment of the accelerants as the Inflation Reduction Act. For those of those who were not watching the airwaves in this past summertime, the United States put at least $370 billion of incentives for deployment of promising decarbonization technologies across the economic system: mobility, the built environment, energy, almost food production. It is massive. It is cross-economic, and it was frankly somewhat unexpected. For those of us who've been recognizing the potential power of that sort of intervention from a market design. The fact of shifting the economics for a rational choice now at point of buying decision being the decarbonized technology, that is particularly effective. We see this having ripple effects across the economy in a way that we've never seen before. So, we don't see in the United States, at least speaking for myself, we don't see the universal carbon tax coming into fore. We see instead the United States favoring technology-specific financial incentives for everything from electric vehicles to heat pumps, sustainable aviation fuel, and it's both can be very effective. So universal price signal, carbon tax would be great. Would be super helpful for incorporating the actual physical risk that is happening around us every day, whether or not we price it into buying decisions. And at the other end of the spectrum, in terms of ground truth, incentivizing the simply decarbonized technology so that it is truly rationally economic to acquire that technology that is decarbonized also can work at massive scale.
I think Sarah just totally nailed it, and I agree with everything you said. Just to give people a sense of the size of this. This is the U.S. federal incentives for clean energy over different periods of time. And in the 90s, we spent a few $1 billion a year, and now literally it's at least $80 billion a year. In fact, it's probably more than that because these incentives are not actually capped. They are on a per unit cost incentive. And what we've seen historically is that there's a huge flywheel, is all of these technologies get cheaper by scaling. So when government started in Europe with renewables in the 90s and 2000s, when governments start creating incentives or policies that have mandates to scale these clean technologies, the technologies get cheaper. And then when the technologies get cheaper, they tap into new markets, they get more jobs in that area, more people see them, and that actually emboldens bolder policy. So I think things like the Inflation Reduction Act are a massive incentive. They're going to do great things for solar and wind, which will then create needs for other technologies. They're going to do great things for EVs, which will create needs for other technologies to solve those problems. They also massively scale nascent technologies like green hydrogen production, making hydrogen so we can decarbonize things like steel making or have weeks of energy storage. That is a baby industry that's very expensive today that will get cheaper because of this. I had one more thought on policy. I think the other policy unintentionally that's driving a lot of decarbonization is the war in Ukraine. When Putin invaded Ukraine, he made getting off of natural gas, which Europe depends upon to keep the lights on and keep houses warm and to make fertilizer and other things. He made that no longer as an issue of decarbonization for Europe. He made that an issue for energy security for Europe. And so in the very short term, you got coal plants going harder in Europe. They're importing liquefied natural gas from various places. But if you look down over the decade to come, Europe is going to move faster and faster and faster away from fossil methane. And that's going to mean more solar wind, more grid energy storage, ways to do fertilizer. They don't require imported Russian natural gas, and so on. So there's a number of policy prongs, others in Asia as well, that are all accelerating these technologies getting cheaper to when they can just win in the marketplace.
And I would also focus on how this is really, a global story, right? And I think that, it's if we're thinking over the next 10 years, some governments are actually great and they're really embracing decarbonization technologies. Others, the governments are actually relatively weak. So I'll give one example. We backed a company called Veggie Victory. It was the first plant-based meat company in Nigeria, based in Lagos, through Sustainable Food Ventures. And when I was talking to the founder, Hakeem, I was like, Hakeem, what would make things better for you, right? As a founder, as building a company, he's like, honestly, Ryan, consistent electricity. He's like, we have about 8 hours of electricity a day that I can count on, and then the rest is, good luck, right? So we have to think about backup generators. We have to think. So, part of this story, I think, for those of us in the U.S. and Western Europe, is like, okay, well, we have consistent electricity, but all of this clean energy actually unlocks things that we take for granted. In many of the developed countries, right? And so this is a global story. Over the next 10 years, Nigeria alone will go from 200 million people to 400 million people. So this is a global story, and it's really how we can make better technologies, and all this will accelerate technology together. Right. So the fact that he's going to have access in his factories to reliable 24 hours of electricity through solar, through wind, through various other applications, that's going to make a huge difference. And so I guess mine is the counter. When you don't have strong governments and you can't rely on strong governments, actually the private markets can really deliver on that end. And I think investing in those private markets, we've seen that they can really help with leapfrogging existing limitations too.
Let's talk a little bit more about startups. I like these concrete examples to help kind of illustrate the point of what's happening. Are there any other startups that come to mind that stand to gain from the government funding initiatives, or just from how startups today are different from maybe 10 years ago? just given the developments that have happened? Or what are some of your favorite technologies that are coming to roost over the next several years? Mez, I see you smiling. Would you want to contribute?
Well, one of my startups announced a Series B today, and they're helped. So
Great.
the hypothesis a few years ago that we would see EVs get cheap enough that they would go from being only sold to people that live in detached homes to condo owners and apartment dwellers having EVs. There's a little company called Zeal that does software for smart control, makes having chargers for apartments and condos much, much cheaper. And they had a massive Series B announcement today. So I think that topic of EV charging, how do we do it? What do we do when EVs get out to more people? Because the new incentives in the IRA actually cap income and cap price of the EV to get the full benefit of the tax incentive. So they're going to push more EVs into the mid-market and lower market. Another one that I've seen a lot of is every green hydrogen startup I know is raising. It was able to re-raise if they want to. Grid energy storage startups are able to raise more because now there's an incentive specifically for storage. Before you had to be attached to a solar farm with the solar farm's incentive. So there's just a huge raft of these. And in hydrogen, I'd also say that there's a lot of investment in hydrogen production. No one has solved the problem really of storing and moving hydrogen around. So it's an area that I think is nascent that will get sort of an indirect tailwind from all of this.
So at Voyager, we invest in companies that are selling products that are simply better and lower cost. We don't look at anything that has a green premium. We think those are niche markets at very best and not relevant to the massive potential commercial scale that drives climate outcome on the timeline that matters. And we see, to your question regarding government support, the price declines in the foundational technology of energy storage, of renewable energy generation. It enables now mass retail scale as Mez points out, electric vehicles being simply the better choice for everybody. The cost of owning an electric vehicle is lower now than that of an internal combustion engine. When we think about the pricing power and the purchasing power of what the Inflation Reduction Act represents. So I worked in the White House in the first Obama administration. We thought the $90 billion to the First Recovery Act was a big deal. It was at that point. Fast forward, though, now more than a decade, and $370 billion applied across technologies that have gotten 90% cheaper. It's not a linear possibility set. It is exponentially bigger in terms of the amount of clean, decarbonized stuff you can put out into the world and what that means for really reshaping the overall energy intensity of the foundation of the American economy. It is exciting. This is a big day. This enables people to simply buy the decarbonized choice on economically rational grounds, not because people feel like, oh, I should do this. To Ryan's point, if it doesn't taste better, it doesn't go faster, it's not a better choice, few people are going to buy it. So we don't look for companies that are, requiring subsidy to make the unit economics work. We look for companies that are simply poised to really appeal at a mass retail scale. And that's what we have in the United States now.
I think that's really smart. And the way that I look at it is the subsidies, the biggest impact a subsidy has is not lasting forever. It's helping those technologies get out to larger scales so they get down that cost curve.
And actually, Ramez, just to link in with subsidies, on the food side, which I know that many of us are very interested in, actually subsidies act in counter to that. So they keep sunset industries still alive, right? And so, one of my favorite examples, and probably one of the areas that I'm most interested in is basically animal ag, right? And so that because of the subsidization, particularly in the US and also in the EU of animal ag, it means that these very, very thin margins allow animal ag to kind of continue. And one of the themes that I'm very excited about, and we're talking about the next 10 years. So by 2035, there was an incredible report called Disrupting the Cow. It basically said that all animal ag will be gone, right? It'll be literally gone, bankrupt. Animal ag will be bankrupt by 2035, right? It sounds almost hard to believe, but when you start looking at the margins of these companies, and particularly when you look at things like the milk industry, you can actually see that the milk industry is barely profitable. And in fact, the largest milk producers in the US have already gone bankrupt, right? And so you actually start to see the economics of these companies hardly make sense with subsidization. Without it, they make no sense. And so that allows new technologies to step in their place. And so that's going to unleash a huge amount of technologies. My favorite reflection is biology is technology, and we are starting to really harness it.
I really love this reflection, and I'd like to talk about food a little bit more. The idea that kind of new technologies will have just better economies of scale, and then will make older technologies like traditional farming and ranching obsolete. It's a really kind of interesting perspective. I was thinking that farming and ranching might be falling out of favor because of emissions, and that's one aspect to it, and maybe water use and land use. But you're basically saying that it's the unit economics of these newer technologies. They're just so much better that allow them to scale faster. Is that right?
Yeah, it's inefficient, right? So when you start to think from a first principles perspective, biology is exponential, right? So what that basically means is, if you have a doubling time of 24 to 48 hours of a muscle cell, and you're able to grow, a lab grown, slab of muscle, whether it's some beef or some chicken, from a first principles perspective, you can basically, you start with 100 pounds. Within 24 to 48 hours, you have 200 pounds. And you can kind of play with those exponentials and realize, like, actually at scale, once we start to harness these technologies, it's not just for food, but it's for all types of biomanufacturing. It is transformational what we can do and how we can usher in humanity into a new age of essentially abundance. And it's not just biology, right? It's software, it's robotics, it's, cleaner energy, like it's all, they're going to unlock the production of these things. And so it's basically, what we've seen in some areas of biology and biomanufacturing is that in many cases, they beat Moore's law in terms of improvements in cost, right? Reductions in cost. With Wild Earth, one of the strategies that we found is we're starting first with cell-based meat, so cell-based chicken, so slaughter-free chicken, real chicken, but brewed in a lab. We start with flavorings. That is a cost-effective price point already to unlock the use of cell-based technologies like that. And so we're going to see lots and lots of applications like that across the board. And I think the real game changer, I think plant-based is great. I love eating a plant-based burger. It's fun. I actually like the taste, but I realize that for the vast majority of people, they want real meat. They want real chicken. They want real beef. And we can do that now with biology and the state of biotechnology today.
So Tommy, you told us to state where we disagree, to be controversial, to make it a better panel.
Yeah.
So I want Ryan to be right. I've known Ryan for years, and I love the stuff that he does. And I used to be more bullish on that. I'm a little bit more skeptical. And so that would be the best thing for the world. Like from an emissions standpoint, the biggest impact of agriculture is actually the amount of land we use and how we deforest. And that's what causes species loss. Primarily up till now, it's been agriculture and fishing has what's destroyed species, not yet climate change, right? So if we could shrink the footprint to bioreactors, amazing. I'm less optimistic about the economics coming down. So I have a counter bet, which is I actually look for things that make on-field outdoor ag work much better with higher yields and lower carbon footprint. We know that high developing countries like the US and Europe produce 4 times as much food per acre as a low developing country like Bangladesh, and twice what the world does. And so there's opportunities to look for ways to improve that. They're hard. Ag tech is really hard, I gotta say. And actually the exits are sexier and faster in alternative proteins. So that's what Ryan's talking about, to be completely honest. But from a global impact standpoint, I think in 2050, the vast majority of calories will still come from outdoor farms. And 25% of emissions come from farming, most of that being cattle and deforestation caused by grazing cattle or growing crops for cattle, or the inputs we have to put on the ground to raise the crops that go into animals. So I'm really excited about nitricity, for example. Fertilizer is 6 to 8% of global carbon emissions, and nitricity uses plasma, uses electricity to make lightning that makes fertilizer from the air with zero carbon emissions and zero decomposition. So things like that are where I feel that there's greater impact. But ag tech is also a hard place to venture, so I'm much more selective. And
I don't think we disagree in this in the sense, because I agree with you. I think, in field applications, things like nitrogen fixation is very underappreciated. Whether you do it, that was actually the first I've heard, using basically plasma to get nitrogen from the air. I think it's brilliant. But you can also use biology too, right? So you can engineer microbes in the soil. You can actually genetically modify the crops themselves to actually collect their own nitrogen. So there's lots of ways to do it. And I agree that we have to have, sometimes it's seen as a low tech solution, but actually biology is exquisitely complex.
I think that's awesome. And I think also that we have this interesting world where CRISPR has allowed us, and gene editing in general has allowed us to create crops where we selectively edit their genome, but they're not called GMOs. A GMO in the US and probably in the UK is only when you moved a gene from one species to another. It's a transgenic. If you just go into your genome editor and tweak a few things, flip a few bits, as they were 4 bits, I guess, that does not count as a GMO in the US and probably won't in the UK, in the rest of the world. And it's a technology that allows us to edit faster and cheaper, do more experimentation. So I do think that there's a lot of that sort of the Moore's law of biotech that Ryan was talking about, or better than Moore's law of biotech, can be applied to help on-field stuff. Maybe that'll produce crops that grow better in vertical farms as well, or that are feedstocks that we use to make these alternative proteins. We'll see.
Yeah, it's a new green revolution, right? We always need new green revolutions to feed more people, and that's inevitable. Whether it's farm applications, some of the vertical farms, or whether that's alternative proteins, things like brewing cell-based meat, which there are still some technical challenges to scaling that. But it is approved, right? In Singapore, these technologies are already approved. People are eating cell-based chicken. I would love, to request the FDA and the USDA kind of get together and move and start approving these technologies. I'm hopeful for next year. I'm hopeful, but
regulatory clarity. And sometimes regulations, sometimes subsidies are bad also, but regulatory clarity, in addition to incentives, that matters so much.
Yes and no. I think the regulatory clarity in the EU has been actually retarding the overall biotech. And we were all nodding here, but it's just so frustrating to see this prohibition on GMOs. It means that Singapore, United States, much more promising markets to get a biotechnology in biomaterials and food business off the ground. And it's Europe is really lagging behind here. It's clear, but it is behind. I will say too, we were instructed to keep things spicy, but I agree with both of you, and our portfolio really illustrates that we focus on the first principles approach to thinking through, what is the promise of biomanufacturing and how can that enable better unit economics in the production of both materials and food. Both outdoors and in bioreactors. We've made 2 investments from Voyager, one in alternative protein production company, and one in biotech for replacing traditional synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, to both boost yield and permanently remove carbon in the course of doing so. And it comes back to, again, what's going to have a shorter supply chain? What's going to have a higher yield on overall inputs of energy, calories, food, whatever it might, the overall cost. These are simply more efficient production methods that yield uniformity in whatever the market is pricing, be it uniform leather, uniform beef, or in this case, a more reliable nitrogen fixation without having to cart around tons of synthetic fertilizer. So it's whatever is going to be lower cost, shorter supply chains, and more robust unit economics overall.
And by the way, just to loop that back to what Sierra was saying, the war in Ukraine made natural gas more expensive. What do we make fertilizer from? Natural gas. So if you can have some way to fix nitrogen without that, amazing, even without a subsidy. It's just farmers want something to lower their costs.
Yep.
As it's a great segue into the next industry. Let's talk about energy for a little bit. There's been a promise of abundant energy right around the corner, from fission, fusion, maybe geothermal, even space-based solar. So where are we today? What can we expect in the next 10 years? Will we deploy more nuclear? Will fusion become viable? And how should we think about investing in energy?
So I'd say this, the things that we know are getting cheaper and scaling are solar, wind, batteries, offshore wind included in that. Those are the things that have these learning rates like this. Those technologies have hit the low level of the S-curve where it starts to go up. Solar and wind together are like 11% of global electricity, which is really not that much. And I say the first 1% was the hardest, actually. Now they've hit the point where in the US, cost, even without the IRA, is not a blocker for building solar or wind. It's actually NIMBY, permitting, and transmission. If you can clear those roadblocks, these things are now going to go up and up and up. But they're going to hit the slowdown at the top of the S-curve when we deal with seasonal variability, not just like hour to hour, not like going through the day-night cycle, but the fact that in Europe, for instance, Northern Europe gets 1/7 the sunlight in December that it does in June or July, right? That's the UK. And so if that's happening, you need to be able to shift, weeks worth, months worth of power around via storage, which we don't have a technology for today. Maybe that's hydrogen. Or you need a clean, firm energy source, like the next generation geothermal companies that instead of requiring a hotspot where magma is close to the crust can put geothermal almost anywhere. Companies like Fervo or Ever, I'm not investors in them, but they're both going after things like that. Or making fission cheap, we'll see. It's not going well so far, but I think we should keep trying. We need more tools in the toolkit than we want. Like we should assume that some will fail, so let's invest in a whole bunch of things. Fusion, I think fusion net energy gain will happen this decade. I'm fairly convinced of that now, or I think it's high probability. Will fusion be cheap? I don't know. The fission plants also have very low fuel costs. Fusion might have a zero fuel cost with the capex of that plant. And crazier thing, I think floating offshore wind is it's the most underrated power source in the world. It can go to deeper water, further from shore, where the winds blow faster and steadier. And you don't have to run transmission as long. But even crazy things like space-based solar beaming down to Earth, that did not pencil out. That made no sense 5 years ago, 3 years ago, until we started talking about Starship from SpaceX bringing down launch costs by multiple orders of magnitude. And now in Excel, I can make it pencil out. Can somebody actually build it? I don't know yet, but crazy things start to look actually possible.
I think it's going to be a competition among commodity electrons. It's not like electrons are green or brown or whatever color you might want to think of them. This is what is going to be the cheapest, most reliable source of electricity on the grid. And to Mez's point, solar, wind plus storage, like that is shooting down the cost curve. It is the cheapest source of electricity in many parts of the world now. In some cases, it's cheaper to run, to build a new solar facility than to run an existing coal plant. I think people don't recognize it is so much cheaper, and it is getting cheaper by the day. That's exciting. And so, when you project out 10 years, is that cost going to be able to beat whatever else we might see in the form of geothermal, in the form of nuclear? The capex, I think, for nuclear should not be underestimated, and the difficulty of actually getting distributed nuclear facilities set up around geographies right now. Like we're having trouble permitting solar in California. Like it's the regulatory construct can be really sticky, even for very promising technologies. So 10 years out, remains to be seen what that source of cheap, reliable electrons are going to be. It is an ultimate commodity, though.
I think Sierra totally knows that really clearly. To add on to that, it's that bending of the hockey stick at the top. Let's say it's a third, somewhere between 10, 20, 30% of the power we need to add, where it's about reliability rather than the cost. So right now, there's going to ratchet up from 11% electricity. It's going to go faster and faster than you think. But we still have to solve that reliability issue for that seasonal thing.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, I just wanted to say for all the sci-fi nerds, I'm not involved in energy, but I love that Mez basically said, by this decade, we're going to get, fusion, some form of fusion, whether it's scalable or not. Like that is super exciting, right? So I just wanted to kind of mention that's got me thinking, okay, where could we use fusion? Like that is very, very exciting tech.
definitely the most exciting time for fusion ever.
Let's talk about other materials that we make. So cement, concrete, and steel, they require a lot of energy and they produce a lot of emissions. Are these heavy kind of industry technologies areas that you invest in? Or do you focus more on tools to kind of enable the built environment, say, such as software that helps with construction or energy optimization in buildings? Here, you mentioned a company in that space, or both. And what are the risks? What should private investors think about in the built environment and materials?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so yes to all three. We invest in deep tech, software, and biotech. He's heard exactly. I mean, that's the thing. There is massive opportunity in all segments of decarbonization of the global economy. It's like, I think we'd be remiss to ignore the massive opportunity in deep tech and in, decarbonizing these huge industries like steel and cement. One of the things that's interesting there is that these are industries of massive size, and so if you can create a technology that is simply lower cost and as reliable or better than the current paradigm, you're going to have a big market waiting. We've not made any investments in any cement companies, so I don't have a sort of particular pony in this race as of yet, but we see the opportunity that there is a huge market available to companies that can out-innovate these frequently antique paradigms of production, where it's like the state of the art is like 100 years old. Like that is very low-hanging fruit.
I'm with you, Sarah. I draw a slight distinction between buildings, the built environment, in terms of managing the energy that we use mostly to heat and to cool those buildings. I think that's an area where it's mature. It's often an energy and cost savings to the building. To Sarah's point about not having a green premium, just doing something that's better, cheaper, faster. Sometimes that's software. Sometimes it's actually a fintech or a finance sort of play of how do you actually make that not a one-time giant capital outlay. And there's been a number of great, interesting startups in that space. There have been a few investments there. I think things like steel and cement are in a different stage. So making those, steel is 8% of global carbon emissions, making it. That's 3 times the size of aviation. Cement is maybe 6%. Those are still sort of in the earlier phase of their learning curve, where they're not yet price competitive, but so we need demand pull to pull them down so they get cheaper and cheaper in those technologies to make steel without using coal, to make a concrete that's carbon negative. And we're seeing that happen both from policy, which is happening in Europe and a little bit in the US. So hydrogen is one of the technologies that can do this. And the hydrogen industry gets scaled a lot and gets driven on its cost curve a lot, making it more potentially feasible to use green hydrogen to make steel, for instance, instead of coal. But also from consumers and businesses. You have BMW and other auto OEMs trying to source green steel that was made with no carbon emissions for their high-end vehicles because the customer wants it, actually. Like, I try to avoid things where there's a sort of green premium, but at some point you see that customers want the product they buy to be green, especially if it's already a premium product, has a premium brand around it. And that in turn is creating this B2B demand for green industrial products like steel, other metals, cement, and so on. I think that's an exciting place to be, and that'll help us get those technologies down to where they're cost competitive.
So when we talk about climate change, it often goes hand in hand with reducing greenhouse gas emissions, which we call mitigation. There's also the idea of how we react and address extreme weather events like forest fires, heat waves, floods. So that's the adaptation section. How will mitigation and adaptation evolve in the next 10 years? Should we pay more attention to one or the other?
Look, climate change is going to get worse before it gets better. Like, I'm an optimist. We've warmed about 1.3 degrees Celsius. I think we have a real shot at staying below 2. There's a roll of the dice involved, but staying below 2 means that 10 years from now, climate impacts are going to be more obvious. That's going to increase deployment of capital, both into mitigation, deploying new clean energy. We're going to be like, well, we got to do something. But it's an even easier sell in many ways to do adaptation because people just adapt on their own. Whether or not they believe in climate change, if the sea's rising, you move or you build a seawall, right? If the crops don't grow because salt water is creeping into the water table. You figure out a way to grow something there that you can. So a lot of adaptation funding will happen without people even necessarily realizing that it's climate or acknowledging that. The area of adaptation, so I think that's a totally legit area. It's fair game for investment. I'm excited about it. If we can make that lower cost for people, make it work better, get ahead of the game. The area of adaptation I'm most worried about not being easily venture fundable is the parts of nature that are in the commons, that we might derive value from. So forests are borderline. Forests are close enough to us. I've seen a dozen forest fire fighting startups in the last year. I would think that coral reefs are actually most often around poor countries. We might start losing all of them at 1.5 degrees C. That might become the point at which bleaching events become so common that it's decline and decline and decline. We'll see. There's some papers. No models are ever totally perfect. Let's hope they're wrong. But that's an area where I think we need adaptation, not just for humans, but adaptation for natural ecosystems that we get services from, that we get purified water from, or we get fish that have grown up on squirrels, feed 800 million people. And that's an area that I think we have to acknowledge the capital stack is not just venture. There's government funding, there's philanthropic funding, there's venture funding, there's debt funding, there's prizes, there's foundations. So I think we'll see more happen on all of that because we have no choice.
Mm-hmm. I concur. I think there's going to be unlocking of sovereign investment in these areas of geopolitical priority and of true public interest, where the benefit is diffuse and universal, where there's not necessarily a single point of return of capital to a specific investor.
Usually, especially in the technology worlds, I have a kind of an unusual perspective because I'm a biologist. And so I think in terms of evolutionary timescales. And so I have faith in humanity. We always solve our challenges, right? Whether it was, cooking our food and inventing fire, or staying warm, inventing fire, or using furs to go into colder climates, all the way through to, it's easy to forget. We only invented agriculture 10,000 years ago, right? Like 10,000 years ago, if you go past that point, our ancestors were hunter-gatherers, right? And so in 10,000 years, we've done all of this. And we've only just begun, right? We now have software, we have robotics, we have biotechnology, like we have all of these ways of saving humanity. I'm not a Malthusian. For those of you familiar with Malthus, he basically said, the end is nigh for humanity because we're going to hit some constraint and then we're gone. And I don't believe that. Like, I believe that we use technology to find solutions to our challenges. I actually, with Mez, that one perspective around the commons, the problem with the commons and the wild spaces, that's actually why I called Wild Earth Wild Earth. My vision for Wild Earth is to help rewild spaces by reducing our footprint on the planet. And so my vision was to start in pet food because it's so huge. I mean, it accounts in the US, it's 25 to 30% of the meat we consume goes to our pets. It's like a massive number. Sierra knows this. Thank you, Sierra. Sierra was an investor and a backer of Wild Earth in the early days. And so, the vision is if we help other entrepreneurs, I think we can start to find ways of these, tragedy of the commons issues, especially around our wild spaces. And so, David Attenborough is I'm a big fan of his work, and Jane Goodall. How do we help naturalists like that preserve these wild spaces, right? And that's something that I think that all of us play a role in, whether it's governments or private individuals and entrepreneurs. We have to find a way.
All right, I want to get to a rapid fire section before we then kind of wrap things up with final question. So this rapid fire is going to be a game of underrated or overrated. I'm going to state some concepts and you just say if you believe it's underrated or overrated. Chances are everyone's going to agree, but if you have a hot take, I would love to hear it. And so no wrong answers, though I might ask for your rationale. And then let's just go in order. Let's go Sierra, Mez, and then Ryan, okay? Okay, so one example would be like measuring personal carbon footprint. I might say it's overrated because we actually need system level change, not individual level change. But you might say it's underrated because change starts with the individual. All right, so there can be various viewpoints here. Home electrification.
So
Well, do you think it's underrated or overrated? Just
Yeah, I think it's underrated for the reasons of the health benefits to internal interior air quality, not yet playing into the overall calculus as it should. Getting rid of fossil fueled combustion engines inside your house, like you should do that for your own lungs.
Great. Mez?
Underrated, focus on building heat. Don't try to attach it to people's stoves. Sarah's totally right that gas stoves are unhealthy. People are emotionally wedded to them, but they're not emotionally wedded to whether their space heater is gas or electric. So I'd say focus on heat pumps first.
Yeah.
Ryan, quick thought on it?
Underrated, 100% underrated. I think electrification is going to be huge.
Great. All right, moving on. Next concept. Let's start with Ryan on this one. Lab-grown food.
I mean, I actually think it's underrated. I think that, we've got a lot of FUD at the moment. And so I think that that's good for those of us that want to keep building. But it's inevitable, right? So in the next decade, our food system will be transformed.
Sierra?
Yeah, I concur on this. The overall fragility of supply chains that was laid bare by COVID and by ongoing geopolitical turbulence, it speaks so precisely to robust production mechanisms that are not inefficient for reducing the overall resource draw for protein production. Completely underrated.
Overrated for producing consumer products, but that doesn't mean that there's nothing there. There's some good stuff there, and I'm really glad we're trying it, and I'm hopeful that I'm wrong.
Geoengineering, Mez, let's start with you.
Massively underrated. The only chance we have, besides a really lucky roll of the dice, to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius is sunlight reflection. Mm-hmm. We spent, this year, we'll spend about $1 trillion on deploying solar panels, wind, and electric vehicles and batteries. The total annual budget for R&D for determining how solar geoengineering, solar radiation management, sunlight reflection, so putting a tiny fraction of sunlight back into space, that total annual research budget is around $10 million. It is 1/100,000th of what we spent on deploying clean energy. I'm not saying we should do it, but it is absolutely criminal, and it is the dumbest thing in climate that we're not doing some science to fully understand sunlight reflection.
Completely agree. Like, this is the top investment potential for just marginal use of dollars on benefit of future generations and humanity. I mean, we got to understand the science. This, like, the potential for this to buy us time to actually decarbonize production systems. It could be massive. We need to know. I mean, it is completely underfunded.
I would say underrated, but I'm going to do something a little bit different. I believe we should genetically engineer our environment. And so I think we should make crops and plants, like we have all this unused land, deserts. Why don't we turn those into rainforests, right? How do we engineer crops to grow in that? The bleaching that Mez mentioned, well, it turns out you could actually genetically engineer coral reefs to withstand increases in temperature. I know this is a bit of a controversial take, but I think we should use the tools of biotechnology to actually help support a more vibrant wild earth. Wild Earth, yeah, you got to plug in there, but it was a more vibrant wild spaces. Yeah, more vibrant wild spaces. I love, biology, but I also love the tools and the things that we can do to improve the biology that exists on this planet.
Okay, the penultimate question. National energy independence, basically for each state or country rather. Underrated or overrated?
I mean, impossible.
Very problematic concept. It doesn't work.
Yeah.
It doesn't work? That's interesting. Okay, so energy independence is not possible today? Doesn't work?
Well, so in renewables, all the models say the bigger a grid you build, you want to build continent-sized grids to get the highest reliability at the lowest cost. And even for things like oil, it doesn't matter if the US produces more oil than it consumes. It's international buyers can still bid on those same cargoes. So if the price of oil goes up somewhere else in the world, it goes up here too. So there is no such thing. Markets are interlinked. The only way to build resilience against things like fossil fuel price spikes or shortages is to need them less.
Mm-hmm. So that's where I will say also, something that's totally underrated, energy efficiency. Loved energy efficiency for so long, completely overlooked. Energy efficiency. way of the future.
Thank you, Sarah. All right,
Tommy, I just want to do one plug. Fossil fuels are biology. So I'm doing a plug for biology, right? It is literally biology again. And so we can use the tools of biotechnology to make better fuels as well.
Interesting to open that up right at the end. Let's go on to the final question. A lot of the public discourse and narrative about climate change focuses on doom and gloom. So I'd love to hear from you. What gives you hope and optimism about investing in climate or working in climate? Ryan, would you start us off?
Yeah, I mean, my evolutionary perspective, right? I come at it from a biologist and I look at us, the history of us. We're probably a species that is maybe 250,000 years old, right? Not that old, but human-esque type species have existed before us. We will find a way. Like I'm an optimist in that perspective. Like we have found a way. Like how is it that and not particularly interesting hominid somehow became us, right, on this planet? And so I think it's technology. And I think we are a tool using species, and we're really, really good at making tools that solve our problems. And so I think this is an opportunity for us to invest and build new technologies that solve these problems.
Thank you. Mez?
Being a crazy optimist and still being too pessimistic makes me more optimistic. In 2011, I wrote this article saying Moore's law of solar is going to drop like this, 5 times as fast as the International Energy Agency said. I was called crazy, and I was wrong. Solar dropped in cost twice as fast as I thought. 3 years ago, I thought steel was going to be this enormous problem we weren't going to tackle for a decade or two, and now green steel is booming. So it's going to get worse before it gets better, but we have the tools, we have the technology, and every year we have more willpower on this topic.
Thank you. Sarah, bring us home.
Yeah, of course. So we actually recently published a letter on this called Faster Every Day. In recognition of, thanks. It's an encapsulation of the sense of the truly grounded optimism we see as the climate destabilizes. Technology can meet the challenge and actually move us into a future of abundance. We have a choice. We have now more than ever the capital availability. We have the willpower. We have the talent. We have the foundational technologies. It's never been a better time to build in climate tech. And we have the possibility to create a truly abundant future.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I love the density of insights, the startup examples, and just the beautiful vision of the future. Thank you all.